Do you want to knit? People think it's difficult, but it isn't. There are only 2 stitches. So on this baby coat with 2 stitches, I can do these fancy patterns with holes in, this neat little picot edge, the basic stocking stitch. You can do all these things with 2 stitches, just doing them in a little bit different way. So let me put that to one side. The basics are a ball of wool. I'm going to use this kind of medium size wool, and a pair of needles. So for the needles, I'm also going to use a medium sized pair of needles, because if you're using thin wool, you use thin needles, and so on. You need this kind of needle. They've got a stopper at one end, usually with the size on, and points at the other end. Don't use needles like this. These kind of needles come in sets of 4, and they're actually used for things like knitting socks. They've got points on each end. You see that? So if you knit on something like this, when you are knitting and you move your knitting up and down on the needle, you're at great risk just for sliding it off the back end, and then, you know, that's not what you want to do. So let me just put those off to one side. So apart from the knit stitch and the purl stitch, you do need to know how to cast on. There are many ways to cast on. I'm going to show you one right here. I'm using this unfinished quilt as a dark background so you can see what I'm doing with this light wool. I'm hoping that helps it to show up a bit better. To cast on in this particular method, you just need one of these needles. Now you can start from the outside edge of the ball of wool, or you can pull a thread out from the inside, start from there. Often pulling from the inside is better, but I'm just doing a little sample here, so I'm probably going to pull this out again, so I'm just going to use from the outside. Leave quite a long piece of wool. So the first thing you have to do is make a loop or a slip stitch to fit onto your needle. So just make a circle, and then this piece here, just pull through. And then when you pull on that, it pulls into a loop, and you can just slide that loop onto your needle and pull it fairly tight. You're holding your needle with the slip stitch on in your right hand. With your left hand, you're holding the end of the wool, the short end that's cut off. The end that's connected to the ball is in the right hand. Hold your hand like that, wrap this around your finger. Do you see that you're actually making a loop there, really? So wrap it around your finger, and then push the needle into what would be the center of the loop. If you hold those closer together, it would be your loop. Push that under there, wrap it around the needle, and then just pull it through. So over your finger to make a loop, push it through, wrap this one around the needle, and pull it between. Around your finger, around the needle, pull this one through the center of the loop. Now don't pull these too tightly, because if you do, when you try to knit your first row, it'll be so tight you'll struggle to get the needle in. So you don't want great big loose stitches left like that with loops and things. You do want to pull it, but don't really tug on it, so that you can continue on and knit. So when you begin to knit, you know, it is a learning process. So these stitches, they're not difficult, but you have to get the hang of doing it. So my advice would be, don't get some new wool, new needles and just begin a project. I would say plan to discard what you work on for the first little bit. This is simply casting on to learn how to cast on, and then we're going to do some knit stitches to learn how to do the knit stitch. And you'll increase stitches and you'll drop stitches, and that's just part of learning it in the first place. So just to learn it, I would suggest casting on about 20 stitches on some old wool that you don't really care about, and then just practice the knit stitch on those, and I'll show you how to do the knit stitch in a minute. You do want to make these fairly even. Right, let me just count these and see how many I've got. 19, so I'll make one more and then we'll actually do some knitting. So this cast on stitch, you can practice that as much as you want to before you move on. If you forget, go back to the video and look again. And in other videos, I will show you a different cast on. That's just a fairly easy one to get going. So now I'm going to begin the knitting. You're going to use 2 needles, and you're always going to use matching needles when you're knitting something. But in this case, to try and make this clearer for you, I'm using odd needles because I want to use needles with 2 colours, and I'm hoping that helps you see what I'm doing better. So if you look here at what you've made, you've got the length of wool that's attached to your ball of wool. Then you've got this. Now, if you were knitting a project, this nice long piece would be good for sewing it up afterwards. And so, but it's easy to mix it up with the wool you're knitting with. So what I do is I just kind of tie that up to keep it out of my way, and so I don't confuse which piece of wool I'm trying to knit my stitches with. So now I won't accidentally get hold of that one. Now this is English knitting. There is also continental knitting, and it is different. You'll be able to do both, it's not hard, but when you're learning, it's very confusing to watch a video about English knitting and then a video about continental knitting. It'll just be too confusing. So stick to one or the other. This is the English style. So you're going to hold your needle with the cast on stitches in your left hand. Your wool always stays in your right hand now. You're going to put your needle into the front of the stitch, and then it goes through to the back of the needle. So can you see that the bronze needle is behind the grey needle? Take your wool and wrap it around the bronze needle, and it comes down in between the 2 needles. Then pull the bronze needle back, but keep it very close to this needle. Try to keep the point of the needle touching as you roll this around to catch this wool you've just put in between them. That makes your next stitch. Once you've caught it, then you pull the original stitch off the needle. So let's do it again. Bronze needle goes through the front of the stitch but comes up behind the grey needle. The wool goes between the 2 needles. Pull the bronze needle back and catch that wool for your stitch, and then pull the old stitch off. It's almost in 4 movements, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is knit stitch. Do you see how easy that is? The only fiddly bit is when you get to this point and you're pulling this needle back, sometimes it seems a little bit difficult at first to catch that wool. The best way to do that is, as you pull this needle through, try to keep the needle tip touching the other needle. So when you've pulled that stitch, keep this keep this point of this needle touching the grey. That way you don't lose the wool that's going to be the stitch. That's how you catch it. So I'm going to continue on to the end of the row. Now, if you do several rows of this, this is called garter stitch. It's just plain knitting all the way. When I've done a few rows, I'll show you what garter stitch looks like. This is the last stitch remaining on the left needle, and you're just going to knit that as normal. So in, around, catch it, and off. Now your needles are not joined together anymore. So now you're just going to switch hands. You're going to put the needle with the stitches into your left hand and your empty needle into the right hand, and your wool stays in your right hand. And you're just going to begin the second row. There's absolutely nothing different. In, around, through, and off. And you know, this is what makes it so easy. It's just repetitive, the same thing. And eventually when you get doing this, you won't even need to look down at your knitting. You'll just be able to knit and watch TV. And it's a fun thing to do. So I'm going to just turn my camera off for a minute. I'm going to knit a few rows, and then I'll show you what garter stitch looks like. So I've done just a few rows here to show you, and this is garter stitch. And it looks the same on the front and the back. That's just all knit stitches. Now, when you do this, every so often you should count your stitches and make sure you've still got 20 on here. And what you probably may see is that you have extra stitches, or you have some holes down here, and that's okay. And I wouldn't try to fix them on this particular very beginning bit. Just keep knitting. It's the learning the knitting that matters. Later on I'll show you how to fix some of those mistakes, but the more you knit, the less you will do that. For the moment, just ignore them. Later on you'll purposely be making holes. So the last thing I'm going to show you on this is how to cast off. You're only going to cast off on something that you're planning to keep. Now, you know, if you're pretty skilled and you did a great job straight away on your little project and you want to keep what you've made for something for the future, then I'll show you how to cast off. I think that's not going to be true for many beginners, but if it's true for you, well done. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes here showing you how to cast off. You're going to do a knit stitch. In England we call this casting off. In America you may call it binding off. Okay, so I've done 2 knit stitches, just the same as you've been practicing doing. Then I'm going to put my needle into the very first stitch and hold your wool firmly so you don't pull both stitches off, and pass the first one over the second one. So knit the next stitch, hold your wool firmly, put your needle in the first stitch, pass it over the second stitch. And you'll just continue that all the way to the end. When you've just got 1 stitch left, still pass this stitch over it, pull this up so you've got a little loop, cut your thread. I'm actually not going to cut this because I'm going to pull this out and use it again, but you would cut it there, then you would pass that end through the loop and pull it tight, and you just have a single thread hanging there. And that's how you cast off.